Death Blow. Death Blow. Death Blow. Death Blow.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of Death Blow Podcast. Subscribe, like and share my videos, and I even have a website where you can find in the description Instagram, Facebook and TikTok for more updates and news. Listen the new audio version on Spotify and Apple Podcast. The character we are going to talk about today is a drummer who made the German thrash metal history, a 10-year career in the famous band from Gelsenkirchen, Sodom. Of course, I'm talking about him, Chris Witchhunter, real name Christian Johannes Dudek. Christian was born on 18 December 1965 in Essen, Germany. He grew up in the Ruhr Area, known in German as the Ruhrpott. This term refers to the historic industrial region in western Germany known for its coal mining and steel production, centered around the Ruhr Valley. It symbolizes the region's working class identity and cultural heritage. Economic decline in the Ruhr led to increased welfare dependency, particularly in mining communities during the transition period in the 1980s and 1990s. Chris has a brother and a sister, and he was just a teenager at the time and was living with his mother, Erika Winkler, that even met Tom and Joe Ripper many times and they considered a second mom. Chris himself revealed the first meeting with Tom in 1982, and this is what he said. Frank and Tom stood in front of my door saying, "Listen, we heard you are a good drummer. We had that bloody monster, but it didn't work out." Frank Terstegen, known as Aggressor, was already in contact with Chris before, and he became part of the band. He was in other bands before and seemed to have the experience to play drums. The first rehearsal room was in Essen. They carried all the instruments and it worked pretty well. They practiced every day and then recorded 4 songs, which in metal. Their first demo was ready. If you are curious to know more about the discography part, go to watch the Sodom episode I made on Death Blow Podcast. After a while, Frank became really aggressive, and Witchhunter was thinking that it was better to kick him out from the band. Witchhunter told what happened here. Frank wanted to kick me out because I was no use as a drummer. Then the whole situation escalated with a big bang. We screamed at each other in the rehearsal room. And then he continues, "Tom and I, we stick together. We are kicking you out." After Frank left, they were meeting other guys near Essen. Sodom proposed to Mille Petrozza to be part of the band, but he denied. He knew a friend that would be available for the job, Grave Violator. Witchhunter said this. "We jammed with Mille, but he stood by his band Tormentor, which he wanted to push forward." And then there was Peppy, later called the Grave Violator. Peppy was really into the dark and brutal music of Sodom. Their rehearsals were a mix of playing, drinking and partying. That was the beginning of their career to start to play live. First show in spring 1984 in Sinlingen near Frankfurt. Venom was in Germany for an autograph session, and they were called to play a gig with other bands like Destruction and Tankard. The manager of SPV, Manfred Schutz, was in the crowd that night and was forming a new label and was looking for new bands to be signed. And Sodom was one of those. After they got a record deal, it was time to record an album in a professional studio. But they were absolute beginners and they were not used to work with a producer. This is what Witchhunter remembered. The label wasn't sure about the commercial prospects of the music we played. Their music wasn't very popular then. Fortunately, they did give us a chance. In the Sign of Evil was complete. When the record came out, the critics were many. 50% of the audience defined this music not good, and the rest 50% had never heard something like that before. A band that was brutal like Venom. It was the beginning of German thrash metal scene. This is what Chris said in one interview. "I've always been interested in satanic things, witches, etc. but we also read books and watched horror films. Witchhunter was always together with Tom and Reaper that was driving an old Simca car to visit friends and having a good time listening to music in the car. Months were passing and meanwhile tensions grew between Grave Violator and Witchhunter. Chris said here, "He didn't have to go. He left because he had problems with me. I have to admit that I must have said something bad about him. He hated me. We were all very young, 18 or 19. I have to accept that." Chris felt sorry after many years of intrigues and backbiting and began the search of a new guitarist. This time is the time of Michael Wolff, called Destructor. The album they recorded this time has undergone several changes. While they were in Nuremberg recording the album Obsessed by Cruelty, Chris and Tom were really drunk, beer cans all over the place. After they met Uwe Christophers, the second guitarist, after the Deluge second version track was recorded. At the beginning it needed to be a bonus track only. Destructor after that left the band to be in Creator and Uwe replaced him for shows. He didn't fit with the rest of the band, he was very introverted and he didn't like to party. Uwe, on the other hand, after he played some shows with Sodom, decided in agreement with Tom to don't continue together. It was time for another guitarist, Frank Blackfire. Sodom recognized he was the right guy for the job. Frank was invited by Tom to many parties and he was in the band. Tom explained better here. He was playing in the same rehearsal room and Christian decided to approach him to join the band. He had a similar taste in music to ours. He liked Slayer, so we approached him and told him about the record deal and the promotion that we were hoping to put together. He was really a great guy, so he is now in the band. Destruction at the time was without a drummer and asked Witchhunter to go on tour with them and he accepted. This is what he said. "I was free at the time of the Destruction tour, for example, and that's how I came to do that after Tommy left. SPV asked me if I would do it, and as I'm unemployed, I decided to take it because the money was good. It was good fun and I got a lot of good live experience. But I wouldn't be doing it again because I'm fully committed to Sodom now. Now we have Frank in the band. I really want Sodom to succeed." Schmier from Destruction remembers Witchhunter in this interview. "We played a tour together in 1986 when our old drummer Tommy left. Witchhunter helped us out for a whole tour. We were friends and needed a drummer, so we asked Chris and he jumped in. He then came down to us, rehearsed with us, and also lived here for a while. That's where I got to know him very well, of course. Over time, of course, we became even closer friends. He was also a super funny guy. Just as some others might say super or great, he always said delicious. That's why we called him Mr. Delicious. He always liked to lift one back then and a few times tripped a few too many beers before playing. I remember a great time. He was a delicious young man who liked to party and was just in a good mood." Destruction was not the only band to collaborate with, but even Battery. It was the time when Quorton was finding a drummer to go on tour with Katy Frost. Chris stayed with him around 1 week to rehearse and write some songs, but nothing happened except eating junk food and partying, so he came back in Germany. There were some differences with Quorton and he didn't want to leave his band Sodom. This time, they were ready to record a new album. In 1987, they recorded Expulse of Sodomy, an EP, and this is what Chris remembered about this. "We were satisfied with the production. Today, I think it's shit to be honest, but you have to live with that. We were with Harris, the producer, for 2 weeks and recorded 3 songs. The production and the songs really satisfied the band and the result was excellent. At the end of 1987, they released Persecution Mania, one of their best albums. The song Bombenego from this album contains the German anthem, and this is what Chris said. "I can remember many people calling us Nazi after Bombenego. Tommy is not Nazi, I am not, we are not." After this album, they started their first European tour. Things were going very well for Sodom. Tour very well organized and all the rest. The only thing that was not okay was that they didn't get much money for this tour, and Chris complained very much about it. In 1989, the concerts were bigger and bigger. More than 10,000 people were there, and one of those concerts was in Katowice, in Poland. Here, they were welcomed as true rock stars. The bus they were traveling in was surrounded by fans, and this created a certain panic in the band. Frank, in the meanwhile, they were recording Agent Orange, their next album, felt more isolated and distant with the others, and after the release, he left the band. Frank didn't have the same vision of the other two, but in addition, there was another problem. Sodom booked a European tour to promote the album, and they had to search a new guitarist again. At his place, Uwe Baltrusch became the new member for the tour that was incredibly successful. In 1990, another guitarist was chosen, Michael Hoffman, assassin guitarist. If you didn't check out my episode dedicated to Euronymous, I have talked about another project Michael took part of, Checker Patrol, in 1986. Go to watch it now. Better Off Dead, the new album, was recorded very fast. They had prepared already around 15 tracks, and that showed they worked very well with Hoffman. One of the tracks, The So Is the Law, showed to be a very good track, inspired by the famous horror movie The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. While they were recording the album, Chris came up with an idea to make a Bryan Adams cover of the song The Kids Wanna Rock. He was a huge fan of Bryan Adams. The concerts were many and better. They reached many other countries and became the biggest band we all know today. Michael Hoffman received a job offer in Brazil to work as a producer and asked the other guys to join, but they didn't. Michael, in addition, was not getting along with Witchhunter, so they had to continue another time with other guitarists. This time, they found Andy Brings. At the time, he was just 20 years old. Chris was the guy that discovered him and brought him into the band. Tapping the Vein is their next album released in 1992. Witchhunter explains better here about Andy. With Andy came a fresh breeze. We recorded a lot of songs in a short period of time. It hit like a hammer. We recorded the songs just like we wanted to, energy laden, in your face. For this release, they recorded this album in one of the best studio recordings in all Germany, the Herrscht Studios. After they came back from the Japanese tour, things started to be different for Chris Witchhunter. Him and Tom were not talking anymore already during the tour, and he realized he didn't fit into the band. Chris always had alcohol problems before, but this time became too much. Chris said something about it here. Why Tom kicked me out? I'll never forget that. Now you act like I left, but you know very well that you kicked me out together with Brings. If you watched this Sodom documentary, you have noticed this piece of the interview I mentioned now, where Chris is visibly drunk and very angry with Tom about this situation. At the time, he was alive, and I noticed how painful it was for Chris to accept to have been kicked out from Sodom. Harris Jones, the producer, will remember the sessions with Chris here. The recordings in the art studios were a nightmare sometimes. When Chris had a problem with something, he became extremely nervous, and when he had to repeat a take, he became even more nervous. Sometimes he just ran out of the studio because he could not play. He was too run down. Chris himself noticed this problem in the band. The decision to fire Chris was the hardest decision in Sodom history, and Tom himself was sorry, but it was the only thing to do. Chris' problems with alcohol were getting worse, and he absolutely had to recover. Not much is known about Chris' personal life since 1992, except from having a band with a Metallica and Megadeth style, but the project failed because he could not find a singer who fulfilled these expectations. He later became a father and wrote as an editor for some fanzines. His story made a deep impression on me. In his mind, there was only Sodom, nothing else existed, and after he left, he never tried to regain his inner well-being. In these 15 years of absence, he always continued to drink alcohol, and who knows what else. The emotional impact Chris suffered must have upset him so much that he never recovered. 2007, Chris and Great Violator met again after 20 years to record a new album entitled The Final Sign of Evil. The label wanted to release The Sign of Evil because of it. Tom called back the two guys, and Great Violator had all the rehearsal tapes with some songs. For the EP published in 1985, they included only 5 tracks, so right now it was the right time to work on this old material in the studio and maybe release old songs rearranged for the occasion. Thorstein Hein, the producer for this record, wanted to know Witchhunter better and hanged out together many times meanwhile the album recording. He described Chris as a difficult person. If you would have said to him something wrong, he would end up getting angry. Thorstein got drunk with Witchhunter just to be a real friend, able to help him and understand him better, and then bringing him into the studio and work with. Chris was so sick that was able to play for a short time, and the next day was not available due to his problems. But that was not the only problem. Witchhunter thought he had been recruited into Sodom again, envisioning a big return, writing some songs, but this was not the case. Tom wanted a reunion just for this album, and then each of them go their own way. Chris was too messed up to play again, despite his dream was to come back in the band. Sodom and him were one thing. For this release, Sodom were planning to play live at Wacken with all ex-members, which was an incredibly good idea, but Chris was not mentally and physically involved into that. He never appeared on the rehearsal room, and this idea never materialized. The next year, Chris died. Official not on the 7th, but on the morning of the 8th of September 2008. Tom revealed something about his death. Chris and I have had very little contact in the last few years after his release from Sodom. Anyone who has seen the DVD Lords of Depravity will understand why this was the case. Chris' illness is a gradual process that lasts several years. Anyone who knows Chris knows this and will tell you what he did not like to accept help from other people. This, in turn, was also one of the typical signs of his illness, as it killed the self-awareness that Chris would have needed to realize that he could not cope with his problems alone. I myself can barely put together a decent text here in South America because I am running from one show to the next. In the last few days, I have thought several times about cancelling the tour because I would rather be at home in the current situation. But I have since discarded this thought because I know that cancelling the tour would never have been in Chris' best interest. I hope that we, as friends of Chris, will at least be able to help his loving mother and support her in this difficult time. In the beginning of our friendship, she was like a mother to me. Right after this tour, I will support them personally. Maybe we can organize a concert with friendly bands to commemorate Chris in a proper way and to collect €1 or 2 for the deceased. Hey Chris, you played the history of music like a drummer. Rest in peace. He died for a consequence of his drinking, for a multiple organ failure. His friends and family knew about his problem and that he never accepted any kind of therapy. The alcohol addiction caused him several hospitalizations and he was not healing. He fell into coma and died. Chris, according to what Thorstein said, knew about his alcohol problem and that he would have improved, but this was not the case. He was always at the bar drinking and dreaming about the good old days and played football many times for 3 years. At the end of his life, Thorstein was invited at his house where he was living with his mother, and what he noticed in his room were all Sodom pictures. It's like his mind remained in the 90s. After that, Thorstein kept distant with him after an argument, and after some days, Chris died. The family knew he wouldn't last so long. His mother, when Toto came back to see Chris, he discovered that he died, and it was not a good period for him either. For Chris, Sodom was the only reason to live and nothing else. Witchhunter had this demon to deal with, and alcohol was the worst. He had many conflicts inside and were reflected over him. Until the end of his life, he had problems with band members and he never had the opportunity to reconcile and clarify with them. But my opinion about his story is that he was not himself anymore. It was his disease to speak for him. He was feeling bad for everything that was happening around. If you or a person near is affected by alcoholism, don't hesitate to call a specialized center for the treatment of this one. Coming back to him, that's how I like to think about Chris, like the sun inside, a funny guy, always ready to make people laugh around him, and the darkness outside, because he dealt with many problems and lived unpleasant circumstances. That's all for this episode of Death Blow podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, like and share my episodes and click on the bell to be notified with new videos. Instagram, Facebook and TikTok for all the updates and news. See you soon, guys!